Jackie, 3 World Championships with Tyrrell, but is this the first time for you in an Eagle?
It certainly is. It wasn't made for me. It wasn't made for a man of average height. Of course, Dan was very tall indeed. But this was the first car I think that Dan Gurney was properly comfortable in. He built it himself for himself because he was a very tall man. But I don't think in the history of Grand Prix racing there could have been anybody more of a gentleman than Dan Gurney. He was a great American, and everybody in the Formula One fraternity loved Dan Gurney. And when the then Lord March honoured him here a few years ago, Dan was so thrilled and so honoured and so tearful. And he came up and stayed with me the following night at home. And it was a pleasure to be with him for that length of time. And of course he took quite badly ill not long after. But a great credit to America, a great credit to motorsport. And it's one of the most beautiful cars that there's ever been. So it's a little longer than most cars because that was Dan Gurney.
He was a little taller than, as you say, than all the rest of them.
I think he was the tallest Grand Prix driver ever.
Oh, really? Oh, really? I mean, if a youngster had to draw a Grand Prix car in the late 60s, it would look just like this, would it not? With super. The pipes, the hook of the eagle nose, everything.
Well, I mean, the American Eagle. I mean, that's it. I tell everybody if Dan Gurney had gone into politics, he would have been president. And everybody was saying Dan Gurney for president.
Well, you never know what could have happened in the 21st century. Do enjoy your laps around Goodwood. It's going to be another wonderful experience for you.
Well, it's going to be slow, however.
But you'll still enjoy it. That's the main thing. Thank you so very much.
They made an actor president, that Ronald Reagan. Yeah, Dan Gurney would have done a fine, fine job. Jackie Stewart out demonstrating the Westlake engined Gurney Eagle.
Well, as Jackie Stewart goes out onto the track in the glorious 1967 Belgian Grand Prix winning Eagle Westlake, Doug Knight, you're alongside me here, and you remember this car very, very fondly, don't you?
I do remember it very, very fondly because I spent quite a time here during the winter of 66, 67 when Dan and his little Anglo-American racers team were actually testing this car with its Westlake engine and doing lap after lap after lap here. And earlier, at the start of the previous year, they'd been testing the original Eagle Formula One car with the 4-cylinder Climax engine. And I vividly remember Bert Baldwin, who was the Goodyear tyre technician for the time, riding on the engine cover, looking backwards while Dan drove, looking at the tyres to see how the tyres deformed in cornering. So dear old Bert was effectively the onboard instrumentation device.
The telemetry system.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. A first-hand experience. But with the Westlake V12 engine, which was made in Rye, in Sussex, these cars were just the best that Formula One had ever produced in terms of aesthetics. I mean, just look at the proportion and set of that wonderful projectile. It was a most beautiful car. And the interesting thing with this one, this is the Magpie Eagle, I think it's chassis 104. It includes lots of magnesium and titanium paneling and sections in its structure to save weight. Subsequently, Dan rather went off magnesium as part of the structure of the car. Following the fatal accident to Joe Schlesser in the air-cooled Honda at Rouen in the French Grand Prix. But Dan was a wonderful man, I can't tell you. He was a man who, during his racing career, spoke very little indeed. And at one time, when he drove for Brabham, there was Jack Brabham, who spoke hardly at all, designer Ron Torino, who spoke hardly at all, chief mechanic Timmy Wall, who spoke hardly at all, and Dan, and it was like sort of Trappist racing. They were extraordinary. But with Jackie, when we were fitting him into the car earlier, Jackie is, shall we say, not a tall man, and Dan was well over 6 feet, and the length of that cockpit is right on the limit of Jackie being able to reach the foot pedals. So he's doing darn well at the moment.
It is the most stunning thing, isn't it? That little prow on the top of the nose lip there, which kind of defines it, doesn't it? It's just a gloriously
That was the Eagle's beak.
Yeah, it couldn't have been more sleekly packaged if they'd tried. You know, absolutely amazing.
In aesthetic terms,
it was
beautiful.
very different from the Eagle Formula Ford,
oh,
which
yes.
was very bizarre.
Yes.
And
there was
not, not hit with a pretty stick.
No, there was an Eagle Indy car that wasn't hit with a pretty stick either.
Was it hit with a fast stick though? That normally makes up for it.
Yeah, it was quite quick, but not quick enough.
Yeah.
The fat ugly one. But these cars, they were fast. They handled well, and eventually when they built reliability into them, Dan and his teammate, his short-term teammate, Richie Ginther, they finished, I think, well, they certainly, Dan won the Race of Champions at Brands Hatch with Richie third. I think it was third, first and third. And then in the Belgian Grand Prix, Dan finally won what AAR had been set up to do, which was to put an American driver in notionally an American car, even though it was built in this country, at the top of the pile in a World Championship Grand Prix race. And to have won at Spa was wonderful.
Of all places, that's right.
Exactly.
I mean, he'd previously won Grand Prix in the 1500 era.
Yes, he won in Brabham and Porsche cars.
Which we will see the Brabham tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. But when the first Eagle ran in the Belgian Grand Prix in '66, there was a peculiar vibration within the car. And halfway through the race, Dan was absolutely bursting.
That's with the Climax in it,
yes,
was it?
with the Climax four-cylinder engine. It was absolutely bursting. He just had to stop and relieve himself. And so there's the extraordinary spectacle in that I don't think it would happen these days, ladies and gentlemen, but Dan Gurney parked the car, put a rock under the wheel to stop it rolling away. The engine was on tick over. It was ticking over, while Dan had a pee at the trackside.
How did the Westlake V12 compare to the early DFVs, which were also there in '67?
That's a very interesting question. In the claims of the manufacturer, it competed very, very closely with the Cosworth DFV. But in fact, the Cosworth DFV had something like 410, 420 horsepower. And the Westlake engine, it appeared when they tested it against the BRM V12 on the BRM dynos, it was producing about 380.